What if I told you that a simple act of kindness at 2 a.m. in a grocery store would completely transform two lives forever? What if that struggling young man counting pennies for bread would one day become the CEO of a company worth hundreds of millions? And what if the cashier who helped him that night had no idea she was about to change the course of business history? This is the true story of Sarah Martinez and Marcus Chen, two strangers whose lives intersected for just 5 minutes, but whose connection would ripple through time in ways neither could have imagined. The fluorescent lights of SaveMore Grocery cast harsh shadows across the empty aisles as Sarah Martinez glanced at the clock. 2:17 a.m. Her feet ached in her worn sneakers, and she had exactly 4 hours and 43 minutes left on her shift. At 22, Sarah had been working these brutal overnight hours for 8 months now, ever since her mother's cancer diagnosis turned their family's world upside down. "Just get through tonight," she whispered to herself, adjusting her green SaveMore vest that smelled perpetually of disinfectant and exhaustion. That's when she saw him. A young Asian man stood frozen near the entrance, staring at the self-checkout machines like they were alien technology. In his hands, he clutched a wrinkled $5 bill and what looked like a handful of quarters. His clothes were clean, but clearly secondhand. A too large button-down shirt tucked into jeans that had been hemmed by hand. Marcus Chen took a deep breath and approached the produce section, his stomach growling so loudly he was certain everyone in the store could hear it. He hadn't eaten a real meal in 36 hours, not since he'd given his last $10 to his roommate for utilities. The university had suspended his financial aid after he'd missed too many classes. Classes he'd skipped to work construction jobs that paid cash under the table. "Focus, Marcus," he muttered, doing quick math in his head. $5.67. He counted the change in his palm again. "What can I get for $5.67? He walked slowly through the aisles, picking up items and checking prices with the desperation of someone who understood that every penny mattered. A loaf of generic white bread, $1.29. A small jar of peanut butter, $2.99. That left him $1.39 for what? His stomach cramped with hunger. Sarah watched this young man from her checkout station, recognizing something familiar in the way he moved through the store. She'd seen that careful calculation before, in her own mother's eyes when they'd lost their insurance, in her own reflection when she'd had to choose between textbooks and groceries. Marcus finally approached her lane with 3 items: the bread, the peanut butter, and a small container of generic orange juice for $1.19. Total $5.47. He had 20 cents to spare. "Did you find everything you needed tonight?" Sarah asked, her customer service smile automatically appearing. Yes, thank you," Marcus replied, avoiding her eyes as he placed the items on the conveyor belt. Sarah began scanning. Beep. $1.29. Beep. $2.99. Beep. $1.19. "Your total is $5.47, she announced. Marcus carefully counted out his money. The $5 bill, for dimes, and 7 pennies. As he handed it over, a quarter slipped from his fingers and rolled across the floor, spinning in lazy circles before coming to rest under a candy display. "I'm so sorry," Marcus said, his face flushing red as he dropped to his knees to retrieve the coin. "I'm sorry, It's okay," Sarah said gently. "Take your time." But as Marcus scrambled for the quarter, Sarah noticed something that made her heart skip a beat. In his back pocket, barely visible, was a folded piece of paper. When he bent down, it partially unfolded, revealing the letterhead of Chun Tech Solutions and what looked like legal documents. Marcus finally retrieved the quarter and stood up, his face now completely red. "Sorry about that. Here's the—" "Wait," Sarah interrupted, her mind racing. Are you okay?" The question caught Marcus completely off guard. In the 8 months since his father's death, since his family's tech consulting business had collapsed under mysterious circumstances, since he'd dropped out of Stanford to try to understand what had happened, no one had asked him if he was okay. I'm fine," he lied, but his voice cracked slightly. Sarah looked at this young man, really looked at him. Beyond the second-hand clothes and the careful penny counting, she saw something else. Intelligence in his eyes. The way he held himself despite his obvious struggles. The calluses on his hands that suggested he'd been working manual labor, but the careful way he spoke that hinted at education. "You know what?" Sarah said, making a decision that would change both their lives forever. "I think the orange juice is on sale tonight. Manager's special." Marcus looked confused. "I don't think." 2 for 1, Sarah continued, reaching under her counter and producing an identical container of orange juice. Store policy says I have to honor the promotion even if it's not marked. She scanned the second container, then hit several buttons on her register. And it looks like we have a store credit for returned merchandise that expires tonight. Lucky you. Marcus watched in amazement as the total on the screen kept dropping. 547, 428, 350, 225. Your new total is 225, Sarah announced with a smile. Marcus stared at the screen, then at Sarah, then back at the screen. I don't understand. I didn't have any returns, and I don't think. The computer systems do funny things during overnight updates, Sarah said with a wink. Sometimes customers get lucky. Will that be cash or card? Marcus handed over his money in a daze, receiving $342 and change. More money than he'd had when he walked into the store, plus twice as much food. Thank you, he whispered, and Sarah could see his eyes welling up. Thank you so much. Everyone needs a little help sometimes, Sarah replied softly. Have a good night. As Marcus walked toward the exit, Sarah called out, Hey. He turned around. What's your name? Marcus. Marcus Chen. I'm Sarah. And Marcus? Whatever you're going through, it's going to get better. I can tell. Marcus nodded, unable to speak, and walked out into the night. What Sarah didn't know was that Marcus Chen wasn't just any struggling student. 3 months earlier, he had been the heir to Chun Tech Solutions, a rapidly growing cybersecurity consulting firm that his father, David Chun, had built from nothing. The company had been on the verge of securing a multi-million-dollar contract with a major corporation when David suddenly died of a heart attack at age 48. Within weeks, everything fell apart. Creditors emerged from nowhere claiming massive debts. The company's bank accounts were mysteriously frozen. Most shocking of all, the family's personal assets, including their house, had been leveraged against business loans that Marcus knew nothing about. Marcus's mother, Lynn, had suffered a nervous breakdown trying to understand how their stable, successful life had vanished overnight. She was now living with her sister in Oregon, barely functional and unable to cope with the complex legal battles surrounding the company's collapse. That left Marcus alone in a studio apartment near Stanford, trying to piece together what had happened to his father's company while working construction jobs to survive. He'd been forced to drop out of his engineering program just 1 semester before graduation. Back in his tiny apartment, Marcus sat on his futon and carefully divided the bread into portions. 3 meals tomorrow, he calculated. The orange juice would last 2 days if he was careful. For the first time in weeks, he wouldn't go to bed hungry. But Sarah's kindness had done more than fill his stomach. It had reminded him that there were still good people in the world. As he ate his peanut butter sandwich, Marcus pulled out his laptop and returned to the investigation that had consumed every spare moment for the past 3 months. Chun Tech Solutions had been growing rapidly, specializing in cybersecurity for mid-sized companies. Marcus's father had always been secretive about the business details, saying he wanted Marcus to focus on his studies first and learn the company later. Now Marcus was discovering that his father had been hiding much more than business strategies. The company's financial records were a maze of confusing transactions, shell companies, and offshore accounts. David Chen had been careful to keep Marcus away from the day-to-day operations, but he'd left behind a hidden folder on his personal computer, a folder that Marcus had only discovered last week. Inside were documents that told a disturbing story. Chun Tech Solutions hadn't just been growing organically. David had been systematically underbidding competitors on major contracts, somehow knowing exactly what other companies were proposing. The documents suggested that David had been involved in corporate espionage, stealing bid information and trade secrets. But the more Marcus dug, the more convinced he became that his father hadn't been the mastermind. Someone else had been pulling the strings, using Chun Tech Solutions as a front for a much larger operation. When David had tried to back out or expose the truth, he'd been silenced. The official cause of death was a heart attack, but Marcus had found his father's medical records. David Chun had been in perfect health with no family history of heart problems. The heart attack had happened the day before he was scheduled to meet with the FBI about his concerns regarding the company's practices. Meanwhile, Sarah was dealing with her own crisis. Her mother, Elena Martinez, was fighting stage 3 breast cancer, and the treatments were slowly bankrupting their family. Sarah had dropped out of community college to work full-time at SaveMore. but her wages barely covered the medical bills, rent, and basic expenses. The night shift paid an extra $2 per hour, which made the difference between keeping the lights on and losing their apartment. But the isolation was wearing on her. Most nights, she saw fewer than 50 customers, spending hours alone with her thoughts and the constant worry about her mother's health. What kept Sarah going was the knowledge that every small kindness mattered. Her mother had taught her that lesson years ago when they'd volunteered at a local shelter. Mija, Elena had said, "You never know when you might be entertaining angels. Treat everyone like they might change your life, because someday someone will." That philosophy had guided Sarah through her darkest moments. When she'd given Marcus that extra food and the mysterious discount, she hadn't expected anything in return. She'd simply recognized someone who needed help and had done what she could. 3 weeks after their encounter, Sarah was working another late shift when her phone buzzed with a text from her mother. "Emergency room. Can you come now?" Sarah's hands shook as she called her manager. Elena had been responding well to treatment, but cancer was unpredictable. Sarah grabbed her purse and ran to her car, praying she wouldn't be too late. At the hospital, she found her mother conscious but weak. The latest round of chemotherapy had caused severe dehydration and dangerously low blood pressure. Elena would be fine, but she needed to stay in the hospital for observation. "I'm so sorry, Mija," Elena whispered. "I know you had to leave work. Don't apologize, Mama. Work doesn't matter. You matter." But as Sarah sat in the uncomfortable hospital chair, she couldn't stop calculating. Missing a shift meant losing $120 in wages. The hospital stay would mean more bills. Her manager at SaveMore had been understanding, but she couldn't keep missing work every time her mother had a crisis. She was spiraling into despair when she noticed something on the television in the waiting room. A local news story about a young entrepreneur who had started a tech company in his garage. The reporter was standing outside a sleek office building, discussing how small businesses were revolutionizing the local economy. Something about the story sparked an idea in Sarah's mind. She'd always been good with computers, even teaching herself basic programming during slow nights at the store. What if there was a way to combine her tech skills with her desire to help people like herself? People struggling with medical bills, working multiple jobs, trying to navigate complex systems while dealing with crisis? 6 months after their encounter at SaveMore, Marcus Chen was on the verge of a breakthrough. His investigation into Chun Tech Solutions had led him to a stunning discovery. His father hadn't been the perpetrator of corporate espionage. He'd been the victim. A major competitor, Stellar Security Systems, had been systematically destroying smaller cybersecurity firms by infiltrating their operations, stealing their client lists, and then underbidding them on contracts. David Chun had discovered the scheme and had been trying to gather evidence when he died. Marcus had spent months collecting proof. Financial records, email communications, witness statements from former Stellar employees who had been pressured to participate in illegal activities. He'd even found evidence suggesting that David's death hadn't been natural, that he'd been poisoned with a substance that mimicked the symptoms of a heart attack. The evidence was overwhelming, but Marcus faced a problem. He had no money to hire lawyers, no connections in the business world, and no credibility as a college dropout working construction jobs. Who would believe him? That's when he remembered the kindness of a grocery store cashier named Sarah. Her simple act of generosity had reminded him that there were still honest people in the world, people who helped others without expecting anything in return. If he was going to expose this corruption, he needed to find more people like Sarah, people who cared about justice more than profit. Marcus decided to take a huge risk. Using the last of his savings, he bought a plane ticket to Washington, D.C., and requested a meeting with the FBI's white-collar crime division. He walked into the federal building with a briefcase full of evidence and a determination fueled by months of hunger, loss, and the memory of unexpected kindness. Special Agent Jennifer Walsh was initially skeptical. Young men claiming their fathers had been murdered by corporate conspiracies were not uncommon in her line of work. But as Marcus laid out his evidence, meticulously organized, thoroughly researched, and devastating in its implications, Agent Walsh realized she was looking at something much bigger than a simple case of corporate espionage. The Stellar Security Systems case became one of the largest corporate crime investigations of the decade. Marcus's evidence led to the discovery of a network of corruption involving dozens of companies, millions of dollars in stolen contracts, and at least 3 suspicious deaths of whistleblowers. The investigation took 18 months, during which Marcus served as the key witness. The FBI provided him with protection and a small stipend, finally allowing him to focus on the case full-time instead of working construction jobs. When the trials concluded, Marcus Chen found himself in an unexpected position. The government had seized Stellar Securities' assets, including their client list and proprietary technology. As the victim of their crimes and the person who had exposed the conspiracy, Marcus was entitled to significant compensation. More importantly, several of Stellar's former clients approached Marcus directly. They had been impressed by his integrity, his technical knowledge, and his refusal to be bought off by Stellar's attorneys. They wanted to hire him to handle their cybersecurity needs. At 24 years old, Marcus Chen suddenly found himself with the resources to start over. But instead of simply rebuilding Chen Tech Solutions, he had a bigger vision. One inspired by the kindness of a grocery store cashier who had helped him when he had nothing. 2 years after that night at SaveMore, Marcus Chen walked through the same automatic doors that had seemed so intimidating when he'd been counting pennies for bread. Now he wore a tailored suit and carried himself with the confidence of someone who had faced the worst and survived. The store looked exactly the same. Harsh fluorescent lighting, the same layout, even the same motivational posters about customer service. But Marcus was completely transformed. Chen Digital Security had become one of the fastest-growing cybersecurity firms on the West Coast. Unlike traditional companies in the field, Marcus had built his business on a foundation of radical transparency and ethical practices. He hired people who had been overlooked by other companies. Former addicts in recovery, single parents, people without college degrees but with strong moral character. His company's motto was simple: technology with integrity. And every employee received a living wage, comprehensive health insurance, and opportunities for advancement regardless of their background. Marcus approached the customer service desk and asked to speak with the night shift manager. He had a proposition that would change the life of every overnight employee at SaveMore. But first, he needed to find Sarah. Sarah Martinez? The manager, Mr. Peterson, said when Marcus asked. She hasn't worked here in about 8 months. Left to start some kind of business, I think. Real shame to lose her. Best employee we ever had. Marcus felt a pang of disappointment, but he wasn't deterred. Do you have any contact information for her? I'd like to reach out about a business opportunity. Mr. Peterson was hesitant until Marcus handed him a business card and explained who he was. The manager's eyes widened as he recognized the name Chen Digital Security. He'd seen their commercials on television. I'll see what I can do, Mr. Peterson said. But I'll need to ask her permission first before sharing her information. When Sarah had left SaveMore 8 months earlier, it wasn't because she'd found a better job. Her mother's medical bills had become completely unmanageable, and the stress of working nights while trying to care for Elena during the day had pushed Sarah to her breaking point. She'd been on the verge of declaring bankruptcy when she remembered the idea she'd had in the hospital waiting room. Using technology to help people navigate complex systems during times of crisis. With $500 in savings and a laptop she'd bought secondhand, Sarah had started Navigate, a service that helped families understand medical billing, insurance claims, and financial assistance programs. She'd taught herself advanced programming, web design, and business management through free online courses. Her first client had been a neighbor whose husband had been in a car accident. The hospital bills were incomprehensible, the insurance company was denying claims, and the family was facing bankruptcy. Sarah spent 2 weeks untangling the mess, identifying billing errors, appealing denied claims, and finding charity programs that covered most of the costs. Word spread quickly through their community. Soon Sarah was helping dozens of families navigate medical crises, student loan problems, housing issues, and other bureaucratic nightmares. She charged on a sliding scale based on what people could afford, often working for free when families had no resources. The work was fulfilling but financially unstable. Sarah was making enough to survive, but her mother needed experimental treatments that insurance wouldn't cover. She was proud of the business she'd built, but she feared it wouldn't grow fast enough to save Elena's life. That's when Mr. Peterson called with an unusual message. A businessman named Marcus Chen wanted to speak with her about her work. The name meant nothing to Sarah, but Peterson insisted it was important. He says you helped him once when he really needed it, Peterson explained. And now he wants to return the favor. Sarah agreed to meet Marcus at a coffee shop near the hospital where her mother was receiving treatment. She expected to encounter someone trying to sell her something, or perhaps a former customer she'd forgotten. She did not expect to see the young man who had counted pennies for bread 2 years earlier, now dressed in an expensive suit and carrying himself like he owned the world. "Sarah?" Marcus stood up from his table, smiling nervously. "I'm Marcus Chen. We met at SaveMore about 2 years ago. You helped me with some grocery discounts." Sarah stared at him for a long moment, trying to reconcile the desperate young man she remembered with the confident businessman in front of her. "Marcus? The orange juice guy? That's me," Marcus laughed, though a lot has changed since then. They sat down, and Marcus began to tell his story. Sarah listened in amazement as he described the investigation, the FBI case, and the business he'd built from the ashes of his father's company. But what struck her most was his insistence that her kindness had been the turning point. "You have no idea how close I was to giving up that night," Marcus said. "I'd been living on one meal a day for weeks. I was ready to drop out of school, maybe leave town altogether. But what you did, it wasn't just about the food. It was about being treated like a human being when I felt invisible." Sarah felt tears in her eyes. "I just saw someone who needed help. Anyone would have done the same thing." "No," Marcus said firmly. "They wouldn't have. I went to 12 different stores that month, and you were the only person who looked at me like I mattered. That kindness saved my life, and it changed how I think about business, about success, about everything." Marcus pulled out a folder and placed it on the table. "I've been following your work with Navigate. I know about your mother's illness, about the medical bills, about what you're trying to build. I want to help." Sarah opened the folder and found herself looking at a detailed business proposal. Marcus was offering to invest in Navigate, but not as a traditional investor. Instead, he wanted to create a partnership that would preserve Sarah's vision while providing the resources to scale the business nationally. "I don't understand," Sarah said, overwhelmed. "Why would you do this?" "Because 2 years ago, you taught me that success isn't just about making money. It's about lifting other people up," Marcus replied. "Navigate is exactly the kind of company I want to support. You're using technology to help people during their worst moments, just like you helped me." The proposal was generous beyond anything Sarah had imagined. Marcus was offering enough funding to expand Navigate into a full-service platform that could help millions of families. More importantly, he was offering to cover her mother's medical expenses immediately, with no strings attached. "I can't accept charity," Sarah said, though her voice wavered. "It's not charity," Marcus insisted. "It's an investment in someone who proved she has the character to change the world. Besides, I owe you much more than this." The partnership between Sarah Martinez and Marcus Chen transformed both of their lives in ways neither had anticipated. Within 6 months, Navigate had grown from a one-person operation to a team of 25 employees, all working to help families navigate complex systems during times of crisis. Sarah's mother, Elena, responded well to the experimental treatments that were now fully covered. More importantly, the stress that had been slowly killing their family was finally lifted. Elena was able to focus on her recovery, while Sarah pursued her passion for helping others. Marcus discovered that his success meant more when it was shared. Working with Sarah reminded him of why he'd started his business in the first place. Not just to make money, but to create something meaningful. Their companies began collaborating on projects that combined cybersecurity with social services, protecting vulnerable families from scams and identity theft while they dealt with medical or financial crises. The business partnership evolved into a deep friendship based on mutual respect and shared values. Sarah taught Marcus that success without compassion was hollow, while Marcus showed Sarah that it was possible to help people on a massive scale without compromising integrity. But the most significant change was in how they viewed their roles in the world. Both had started as people who needed help. Sarah struggling with her mother's illness, Marcus devastated by his father's death and the loss of everything he'd known. Their encounter at SaveMore had been between two people at their lowest points, finding hope in an unexpected moment of kindness. Now they were in positions to be the helpers they had once needed. Marcus made it a company policy that Chen Digital Security would provide free cybersecurity services to nonprofit organizations and small businesses owned by people from disadvantaged backgrounds. Sarah expanded Navigate to include free services for families below certain income thresholds. 3 years after their reunion, Sarah and Marcus were invited to speak at a conference about ethical business practices. The event was held at Stanford University. the same campus where Marcus had been forced to drop out when his world collapsed. The business world often teaches us that success is a zero-sum game. Marcus told the audience of students and entrepreneurs that for you to win, someone else has to lose. But Sarah taught me that the opposite is true. When you lift others up, you create value that didn't exist before. Sarah spoke about the importance of seeing customers as whole human beings rather than just revenue sources. Every person who walks into your business is carrying their own story, their own struggles, their own dreams, she said. When you treat them with dignity and compassion, you're not just building a business. You're building a better world. Their story had become something of a legend in business schools and entrepreneurship circles. The SaveMore connection was cited as an example of how personal relationships and ethical practices could drive both social impact and financial success. But for Sarah and Marcus, the real measure of their success wasn't the awards or recognition. It was the thousands of families they were now able to help every month. Navigate had processed over $50 million in successfully appealed insurance claims and had helped more than 100,000 families navigate various crises. Chen Digital Security had prevented an estimated $200 million in cybercrimes against small businesses and nonprofits. Most importantly, they had created a model that other companies were beginning to follow. The idea that businesses could be profitable while also being genuinely helpful was spreading throughout their industry and beyond. 5 years after that night at SaveMore, Marcus Chen was named to Forbes' 30 Under 30 list, and Sarah Martinez received the National Small Business Administration's Entrepreneur of the Year award. But the recognition that meant the most to both of them came from an unexpected source. Elena Martinez, now cancer-free for 2 years, had returned to her job as a high school counselor. She'd started a program called Random Acts of Business where students learned about entrepreneurship by identifying problems in their community and developing ethical solutions. My daughter learned something very important when she was working at that grocery store, Elena told her students. She learned that how you treat people when you don't have to be nice to them, that's who you really are. And that principle has made her more successful than any business degree ever could. The program had spread to over 200 schools across the country, inspiring a new generation of entrepreneurs who prioritized social impact alongside financial returns. Students were starting businesses that addressed everything from food insecurity to elderly isolation to educational inequality. Marcus often visited these schools to share his story, always emphasizing the moment when Sarah's kindness had changed his perspective on what success really meant. I was technically homeless when I met Sarah, he would tell the students. I had lost everything. My family's business, my place in school, my sense of who I was supposed to be. But Sarah saw something in me that I couldn't see in myself. She saw potential, Sarah would add, and Marcus taught me that when you help someone, you're not just changing their day. You might be changing their entire future. That young man counting pennies became someone who could help thousands of other people. You never know who you're really helping. On a cold Tuesday night, exactly 7 years after their first meeting, Sarah and Marcus returned to SaveMore together. They weren't there for nostalgia. They were there to launch a new initiative. SaveMore Community Partners was a program that would provide business mentorship, microloans, and entrepreneurship training to grocery store employees who wanted to start their own businesses. Marcus and Sarah had convinced the corporate headquarters to pilot the program at the same store where they'd met. As they walked through the familiar aisles, Sarah pointed to the checkout lane where she'd worked all those years ago. That's where it all started, she said. A young cashier was working the late shift, looking tired but maintaining a cheerful demeanor as she helped the few customers shopping after midnight. Her name tag read Jessica, and she couldn't have been more than 19 years old. "Excuse me," Marcus said, approaching her station. "Are you the manager on duty tonight?" "No, sir, but I can call him for you," Jessica replied politely. "Actually, I wanted to ask you something. Do you ever have customers who seem like they're having a really hard time? People who might need a little help?" Jessica looked puzzled but nodded. "Sometimes, yeah. Why do you ask?" Sarah stepped forward. "Because 7 years ago, I was working your exact job, and I met someone who needed help. I helped him, and it changed both our lives forever." They spent the next hour talking with Jessica about her dreams, her challenges, and her goals. She was studying nursing while working nights to support her younger siblings after their parents had been in an accident. She had all the qualities Sarah and Marcus looked for: intelligence, empathy, determination, and the kind of character that couldn't be taught. Before they left, Marcus handed Jessica a business card and an application for their new mentorship program. "If you're interested in learning about business while you finish school, we'd love to help," he said. But the real gift was what Sarah gave her: permission to help others the way she'd been helped. "You're going to meet people who need kindness," Sarah told Jessica. "People who are counting pennies, people who look like they're barely holding it together, people who seem invisible to everyone else. When you see them, remember that your kindness might be the thing that changes their entire life." As they walked back to their cars, Marcus reflected on how far they'd both come. "Do you think that young man would have believed this story if someone had told him that night?" Sarah laughed. "Are you kidding? If someone had told me that the hungry kid with the $5 bill would someday be my business partner and one of the most successful entrepreneurs in the state, I would have thought they were crazy. But here we are," Marcus said. "Here we are," Sarah agreed. "And hopefully, we're just getting started." The SaveMore sign flickered in the distance as they drove away, but the light it represented, the light of human kindness and unexpected possibility, continued to shine brightly in the work they did every day. Because sometimes, the most successful businesses aren't built on profit margins or market analysis. Sometimes, they're built on a simple grocery store transaction at 2 in the morning when one person decides to treat another person like they matter. And sometimes, that's enough to change the world. Today, Navigate has helped over 500,000 families navigate complex systems during times of crisis, while Chen Digital Security protects more than 2,000 small businesses and nonprofits from cyber threats. Their joint foundation has provided business mentorship to over 10,000 young entrepreneurs from disadvantaged backgrounds. But Sarah Martinez and Marcus Chen will tell you that their greatest success isn't measured in dollars or awards. It's measured in the kindness they've been able to spread, one person at a time, starting with a simple act of compassion in a grocery store on a cold Tuesday night. Because in the end, we're all just people trying to make it through another day. And sometimes, the difference between giving up and changing the world is as simple as someone seeing you when you feel invisible, helping you when you need it most, and believing in you when you can't believe in yourself. That's the true power of unexpected kindness. And that's how a grocery store cashier and a struggling student became two of the most successful social entrepreneurs of their generation. Not despite their humble beginnings, but because of them.